In the sweltering afternoon heat of June 8, 1962, the moment Vincent Teranova's palm connected with Mayme Johnson's face, he crossed an invisible line that separated the living from the dead in the carefully calibrated world of organized crime. The sound of that slap echoing down 125th Street wasn't just an assault, it was a violation so profound that even the pigeons seemed to stop moving. Within that 30-foot radius of sudden silence, street vendors froze mid-transaction, mothers pulled their children closer, and seasoned hustlers who'd witnessed countless acts of violence understood they were watching something different. This wasn't a mugging, a territorial dispute, or even a hit. This was a desecration of the unwritten constitution that governed Harlem's underworld. The criminal landscape of 1960s New York operated on a complex system of mutual respect and carefully maintained boundaries that outsiders could never fully comprehend. These weren't written rules passed down through official channels or taught in training sessions. They were understood through observation, enforced through consequence, and violated only by the ignorant or the suicidal. Among these invisible laws, one stood above all others with the weight of religious doctrine. A boss's family existed in a sanctuary that even enemies honored. Wives, children, and blood relatives weren't merely off-limits, they were untouchable in a way that transcended the everyday violence of the streets. This protection wasn't rooted in chivalry or moral consideration, it was pure strategic calculation. The moment you touched a boss's family, you transformed a business dispute into a blood feud. And blood feuds consumed resources, destroyed alliances, and left bodies piling up until one side ceased to exist. Vincent Teranova came from a different world than Bumpy Johnson. He was a Genovese soldier, trained in the Italian mob traditions where hierarchy was explicit, where made men wore their status like armor, and where the commission in downtown Manhattan determined who controlled what. To Vinnie, Harlem was just another neighborhood to be brought under proper organization, another revenue stream to be optimized, another group of independent operators who needed to understand that real power flowed from the five families. He'd spent 3 weeks in Harlem collecting protection money, intimidating witnesses, and operating the confidence of a man backed by one of New York's most powerful criminal organizations. What Vinnie failed to understand was that Harlem wasn't Little Italy. The rules that governed Mulberry Street didn't automatically transfer uptown, and the man who controlled this territory had built his empire on a foundation that predated the commission's influence. Bumpy Johnson's Harlem was a kingdom constructed through decades of careful relationship building, strategic violence, and an almost supernatural ability to read the human dynamics that determined who held real power versus who merely held titles. Unlike the Italian families with their formal hierarchies and initiation rituals, Bumpy's organization operated more fluidly, built on networks of loyalty that ran through legitimate businesses, numbers operations, and a complex web of favors owed and debts collected. His power didn't flow from a position granted by higher authorities. It emerged from the reality that nothing significant happened in Harlem without either his permission or his knowledge. Residents might fear the police, but they respected Bumpy. Store owners might pay the Italian families when collectors came around, but they knew who actually protected them. This wasn't territory that could be claimed through intimidation or superior force. It was held through legitimacy, and legitimacy couldn't be taken, only earned. When Vinnie grabbed Mayme's arm and delivered that slap, he revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of the ecosystem he'd entered. He thought he was sending a message of Genovese strength, demonstrating that even Bumpy Johnson's wife wasn't immune to their reach. In his mind, this was a power move, the kind of public dominance display that would establish the family's seriousness and accelerate Harlem's submission to their authority. Instead, he'd just provided Bumpy with the justification to do what the Harlem boss had probably wanted to do since the Genovese soldiers started operating in his territory: send a message so definitive, so spectacular, that it would end all future discussions about who controlled uptown. The witnesses who watched that slap understood something Vinnie didn't. They'd seen men disappear for far lesser offenses against Bumpy's operation. They'd watched bodies turn up in the East River after someone forgot to show proper respect. They'd observed the careful dance of power that kept Harlem functioning, where even the Italian families traditionally sent emissaries to negotiate rather than soldiers to demand. Mayme Johnson wasn't just any woman. She was the wife of the man who'd survived Dutch Schultz, outsmarted Lucky Luciano's attempts at consolidation, and maintained independence while other black operators got absorbed or eliminated. Touching her didn't make Vinnie look strong. It made him look ignorant, and in the criminal world, ignorance was often indistinguishable from suicide. The pity in Mayme's eyes as she stared at her assailant wasn't weakness or fear. It was the look of someone watching a man who doesn't know he's already dead. She'd spent 17 years observing how her husband responded to disrespect, how he calculated the appropriate level of response, and how he transformed individual incidents into teaching moments that resonated throughout New York's underworld. Vinnie Teranova had just given Bumpy Johnson a gift, the moral authority to respond without restraint, the public justification to remind every crew in the city why Harlem remained untouchable, and the perfect excuse to end the Genovese family's expansion before it truly began. In violating the sacred boundary around a boss's family, Vinnie hadn't just attacked one woman. He'd challenged the entire architecture of respect that kept the underworld from descending into endless, resource-draining warfare. And that challenge demanded an answer that would be remembered for generations. The moment Julius Gordon burst through the door without knocking, Bumpy Johnson knew something had shifted in the delicate equilibrium he spent every waking hour maintaining. Julius was a man who understood protocol, who'd worked in Bumpy's organization long enough to know that interrupting the boss during his ledger review meant the sit. Uation couldn't wait for proper etiquette. The words came quickly. Mayme, 125th and Lenox, Genovese soldier named Vinnie Teranova. He put his hands on her. And then the office fell into a silence so complete that the sounds of Small's paradise drifting up from below seemed to vanish entirely. What happened in those 10 seconds revealed everything about why Bumpy Johnson had survived and thrived in a business where most men died young or died broken. Lesser men, men who confused emotion with strength, would have erupted immediately. They would have swept the ledger off the desk, grabbed their weapon and stormed out seeking immediate vengeance with no thought, beyond the primal need to hurt the person who'd hurt theirs. This was the natural response, the human response, the response that felt right in the moment and led to decades in prison or bullets in back alleys. Bumpy understood that the criminal underworld was filled with graves of men who'd let their blood run hot, who'd made decisions based on how they felt rather than what would happen next. True power required something more difficult than rage. It demanded the ability to feel the rage, acknowledge it, and then set it aside to perform calculations that emotion would only corrupt. His first question, "Is she hurt?" wasn't simply about marital concern, though that element certainly existed. It was a tactical assessment disguised as human inquiry. If Mayme was seriously injured, the response would need to be immediate and overwhelming, the kind of dramatic retaliation that couldn't be carefully orchestrated, because time would matter more than precision. If she was physically unharmed, then Bumpy had the luxury of sumped. King far more valuable than speed, he had time to craft a response that would serve multiple purposes simultaneously. The answer that she was home, protected by Illinois, meant Bumpy could think rather than react, could plan rather than explode, could transform this incident from a personal violation into a strategic opportunity. The second question, "Where is Teranova now?" revealed the machinery of calculation operating behind Bumpy's calm exterior. He wasn't asking because he planned to personally hunt Vinnie down in the next 15 minutes. He was beginning to map the tactical landscape, understanding where the pieces were positioned, how quickly they could move, and what options existed for different types of responses. If Teranova had already fled Harlem, that told one story about how seriously the Genovese family took their soldiers' action. If he was still operating openly, that revealed their assessment of Bumpy's likely response. Every piece of information mattered, because Bumpy understood that the action he took in response to this disrespect would echo far beyond this single incident. What made Bumpy Johnson different from the dozens of other operators who'd tried and failed to maintain independent territory in New York wasn't superior firepower or more extensive connections. It was his almost supernatural ability to see several moves ahead, to understand that every action triggered reactions, and those reactions created opportunities or closed them, depending on how wisely the initial move was chosen. A hot-headed response would feel satisfying for approximately 30 seconds, right up until the moment the Genovese family felt compelled to respond to protect their own reputation, which would trigger a cycle of retaliation that would consume resources, destroy profitable operations, and potentially draw attention from law enforcement that neither side wanted. The mathematics Bumpy was computing in those silent seconds involved multiple variables. There was the personal dimension. His wife had been publicly humiliated and assaulted. There was the territorial dimension. The Genovese family was testing his boundaries to see if Harlem could be absorbed into their operations. There was the political dimension. How he responded would be observed and interpreted by every crew operating in New York, from the smallest numbers runner to the heads of the 5 families. There was the legal dimension. Any response dramatic enough to send the proper message carried risks of police attention and potential prosecution. And there was the economic dimension. Whatever happened next would either strengthen or weaken the financial operations that actually sustained his organization. Lesser strategists might have seen only 2 options: respond with overwhelming violence or appear weak by doing nothing. Bumpy understood there existed a third path, more difficult to navigate but far more effective when executed properly. The ideal response would punish the individual transgressor severely enough to satisfy honor, send a message to the Genovese family clear enough to end their expansion attempts, demonstrate to other observers that Harlem remained untouchable, and accomplish all of this while somehow avoiding a full-scale war that would damage everyone involved. This wasn't about revenge. Revenge was emotional, short-sighted, and ultimately empty. This was about recalibration, about resetting the understanding every organization in New York had about where Bumpy Johnson's boundaries lay, and what happened when someone crossed them. The 10 seconds of silence represented a masterclass in leadership under pressure. While Julius waited for the explosion that never came, while Vinnie Teranova probably celebrated what he thought was a successful intimidation tactic, while the Genovese family leadership remained unaware that their soldier had just created a crisis that would require their immediate attention, Bumpy Johnson was transforming from a husband who'd been wronged into a chess master surveying the board. He was identifying which pieces could be sacrificed, which alliances could be leveraged, which intermediaries might be useful for sending messages that needed plausible deniability, and which displays of force would accomplish strategic objectives rather than merely satisfying emotional needs. When Bumpy finally moved, when he finally spoke, when he finally set into motion whatever response he'd calculated during those 10 seconds of absolute stillness, it wouldn't be the reaction of a man who'd lost control. It would be the carefully calibrated action of someone who understood that true power wasn't measured by how quickly you could hurt your enemies, but by how thoroughly you could make them regret ever considering you an enemy in the first place. The dozen witnesses scattered along 125th Street and Lenox Avenue that afternoon didn't just see an assault. They became involuntary participants in a drama that would be retold in barbershops, bars, and back rooms for years to come. Every person within earshot of that slap, very vendor who paused mid-sale, every mother who instinctively pulled her child closer, every hustler who froze in recognition of what had just transpired, transformed from mere bystanders into storytellers who would carry this moment forward into Harlem's collective memory. Vincent Teranova had made a catastrophic miscalculation that criminals far more experienced than him understood intuitively. In a world built entirely on reputation, there's no meaningful difference between what actually happened and what people believe happened, and the only thing worse than being disrespected is being disrespected publicly. Private violations could sometimes be negotiated, absorbed, or quietly resolved through intermediaries who specialized in preventing minor disputes from escalating into major conflicts. A debt unpaid behind closed doors might be forgiven or restructured. A territorial encroachment conducted discreetly could be walked back through diplomatic channels. Even violence, when witnessed by no one or only by people whose silence could be guaranteed, existed in a gray zone where face-saving compromises remained possible. But public disrespect operated under completely different rules that every successful criminal understood with the clarity of religious doctrine. Once witnesses existed, once the story began spreading through the community, once people started talking about what they'd seen and forming judgments about what it meant, the incident stopped being about the actual offense and became about perception management. Bumpy Johnson's power in Harlem didn't flow primarily from his capacity for violence, though that capacity certainly existed and had been demonstrated enough times to establish credibility. His real power emerged from something more subtle and more durable, the widespread belief throughout the community that crossing Bumpy carried consequences so severe that even contemplating it was foolish. This belief system required constant maintenance through actions that reinforced the narrative. Every time someone violated Bumpy's rules and suffered appropriately calibrated punishment, every time a potential challenger tested his boundaries and retreated after discovering them reinforced, every time a story circulated about why you didn't disrespect the man who ran Harlem, the architecture of his power grew stronger. But this system was also fragile in ways that conventional power structures weren't. A police chief who got disrespected could rely on the legal system to maintain authority. A corporate executive who faced insubordination had institutional mechanisms for reasserting control. Bumpy had only reputation, which meant that reputation had to be defended with the same intensity that nations defend their borders. When Vinnie Teranova slapped Mayme Johnson in front of witnesses, he didn't just assault one woman, he challenged the fundamental narrative that sustained Bumpy's position. Every person who watched that slap would tell someone else about it. Those people would tell others. Within hours, the story would spread through Harlem like a virus, mutating slightly with each retelling but maintaining its core message. A Genovese soldier had put hands on Bumpy's wife and walked away. If that story stood unchallenged, if no definitive response followed that was equally public and equally memorable, then every future interaction Bumpy had would be colored by that narrative. Rivals would wonder if his power was diminishing. Associates would question whether his protection was as absolute as they believed. The Genovese family would conclude that Harlem could be absorbed without prohibitive cost. Even ordinary residents who had nothing to do with criminal enterprise would begin to see Bumpy differently. And in a community-based power structure, how ordinary people perceived you mattered tremendously. The public nature of the offense also meant that Bumpy's response had to be calibrated not just for its direct impact on Vinnie Teranova and the Genovese family, but for its effect on every observer who would hear about it. The response needed to be dramatic enough that the story people told afterward would be more memorable than the story of the original offense. It needed to be severe enough that anyone who heard it would understand that the momentary satisfaction of disrespecting Bumpy carried costs that vastly exceeded any benefit. It needed to be distinctive enough that it would be discussed, analyzed, and referenced for years, serving as a cautionary tale that prevented future violations by making potential offenders vividly imagine the consequences. This wasn't about revenge. Revenge was personal and finite. This was about theater, about creating a performance so compelling that it would be repeated endlessly throughout New York's criminal networks. The witnesses who watched Mayme Johnson standing on that sidewalk, her grocery bag spilled, her face red where Vinnie's hand had connected, weren't just seeing an assault victim. They were seeing the beginning of a story they knew would have a second act, and many of them probably felt something close to dread because they understood what was coming. In Harlem, everyone knew stories about what happened to people who forgot to show proper respect, who assumed that protection from another organization made them untouchable, who thought that Bumpy Johnson's reputation was outdated or exaggerated. These stories always ended the same way, with people disappearing or turning up in conditions that served as permanent reminders of why the rules existed. The power of public witness created obligations that private offenses never did. If someone insulted Bumpy in a closed room with no witnesses, he had options. He could choose to overlook it, to handle it quietly, or to respond in ways that served his strategic interest without concern for how others would interpret his actions. But once that slap echoed down 125th Street, once those dozen witnesses existed, once the story began its inevitable spread through the community, Bumpy's range of acceptable responses narrowed dramatically. Anything less than a definitive public reassertion of boundaries would be interpreted as weakness, and in a reputation-based power structure, the appearance of weakness was indistinguishable from actual weakness. Vincent Teranova thought he was sending a message about Genovese's power and Bumpy's inability to protect his own family. What he'd actually done was create a situation where Bumpy had no choice but to respond with overwhelming force, not because he was emotional or vindictive, but because the mathematics of reputation required it. The witnesses scattered along 125th Street that afternoon had seen the beginning of a story that company. Old only end one way, and every one of them knew it. The most unsettling detail in the entire confrontation wasn't Vincent Teranova's arrogance, or the sound of the slap echoing down the street, or even the collective silence that followed. It was the expression on Mayme Johnson's face as she stood there staring at the man who'd just struck her, an expression that witnesses would later describe not as fear, not as shock, not as anger, but as pity. In that moment, Mayme revealed something that soldiers like Vinnie could never understand, because they lived too close to violence to see its larger patterns. She possessed the clarity that comes only from sustained proximity to power, the education that emerges from 17 years of watching consequences unfold, the wisdom that arrives when you've observed the machinery of retribution enough times to predict its movements with absolute certainty. Mayme Johnson occupied a unique position in Harlem's criminal ecosystem, one that granted her perspectives unavailable to the men who actually wielded power or those who competed for it. She wasn't insulated from the business the way some mob wives were, kept deliberately ignorant to protect them from legal jeopardy, or shielded from ugly realities to preserve their innocence. She was integrated enough to understand the dynamics, present enough to observe the patterns, but removed enough to see the bigger picture that men caught in the day-to-day struggles for dominance often missed. While Bumpy spent his days calculating moves and counter-moves, managing personalities, and making decisions that balanced immediate needs against long-term strategy, Mayme watched the consequences of those decisions play out in human terms. She saw what happened to men who miscalculated their own importance, who confused temporary success with permanent power, who mistook the absence of immediate retaliation for the absence of consequences altogether. Over 17 years of marriage to one of Harlem's most powerful figures, Mayme had developed an almost supernatural ability to read situations that would take others months to understand. She'd watched men walk into their apartment radiating confidence, certain they'd successfully challenged Bumpy's authority, or carved out their own independent operations, not realizing they were already dead and just didn't know it yet. She'd observed the careful choreography of respect and disrespect, learning to distinguish between challenges that required immediate response and provocations that Bumpy deliberately ignored because the timing wasn't right, or because letting someone continue their transgression would ultimately serve his interests better. She'd seen bodies appear in rivers, and men vanish from neighborhoods, and families suddenly relocate to other cities, and she'd learned to trace those outcomes back to their origins in moments that seemed insignificant at the time. When Vinnie Teranova grabbed her arm and delivered that slap, Mayme instantly understood something he wouldn't grasp until it was far too late. He'd just transformed himself from a problem to be managed into an example to be made. The distinction mattered enormously. Problems could be negotiated with, absorbed, or strategically ignored, depending on what served Bumpy's larger objectives. Examples served a different purpose entirely. They existed to communicate GES that needed to resonate far beyond the individual incident, to recalibrate expectations throughout the entire ecosystem, to remind everyone from street-level operators to family bosses why certain boundaries existed and what happened when people forgot. Vinnie hadn't just assaulted Bumpy's wife. He'd provided Bumpy with the justification to do something the Harlem boss had probably been looking for an excuse to do since the Genovese soldiers started operating uptown. The pity in Mayme's expression revealed her understanding that Vinnie was now caught in machinery he couldn't escape even if he wanted to, machinery that operated with the inevitability of natural law. She knew Bumpy well enough to predict how the next hours and days would unfold. She could envision him receiving the news with that characteristic stillness that people who didn't know him mistook for lack of reaction, but that actually signaled the most intense calculation. She could imagine the conversations he'd have with his most trusted associates, the messages he'd send through various channels, the careful orchestration of whatever response he deemed appropriate. She'd seen this process play out dozens of times before, though never in response to something as personal and as public as an assault on her. The machinery didn't move quickly. That was for amateurs who confused speed with effectiveness. It moved deliberately, gathering information, positioning assets, ensuring that when action finally came, it would be comprehensive enough to serve all the strategic objectives it needed to accomplish. What made Mayme's perspective particularly valuable was that she understood dimensions of power that soldiers and enforcers typically missed. Men like Vinnie saw only the surface mechanics, who controlled what territory, who had more guns, which family had more soldiers on the street. They thought about power as a simple equation of force and intimidation. Mayme understood that real power was far more complex, built on networks of relationships, sustained through careful management of reputation, and maintained by knowing when to use violence and when to withhold it. She'd watched Bumpy navigate situations where the obvious response would have been catastrophic, where the smart move was counterintuitive, where true strength meant restraint rather than explosion. She'd also watched him handle situations where restraint would have been interpreted as weakness and decisive action was the only option that preserved his position. The 17 years she'd spent as Bumpy Johnson's wife had essentially provided her with a graduate education in power dynamics that no formal institution could offer. She'd learned to read the subtle signals that indicated when men were genuinely dangerous versus when they were performing toughness for an audience. She understood the difference between operators who'd calculated the risks of their actions and those who'd stumbled into conflicts they didn't understand. She could identify the moment when situations shifted from negotiable to inevitable, when the machinery of consequence began moving, and no amount of backtracking or apologizing could stop it. She'd developed the ability to see men not as they saw themselves, but as they actually were, their strengths, their weaknesses, their blind spots, their fatal misconceptions about their own importance. Ding on that sidewalk with her face stinging and her groceries scattered, Mayme Johnson wasn't afraid for herself because she understood something Vinnie Teranova didn't. She was protected by something more powerful than bodyguards or organizational muscle. She was protected by 17 years of precedent, by every previous example Bumpy had made of men who forgot to show proper respect, by the comprehensive understanding throughout Harlem that touching her was suicide. That pity in her eyes was the look of someone who could see the future clearly, who understood that Vinnie had approximately the same life expectancy as a man who'd just swallowed poison, and who recognized that his ignorance of his own situation was almost tragic in its completeness. What Bumpy Johnson ultimately sent to the Genovese family in response to Vincent Teranova's assault transcended simple revenge, or even justice in any conventional sense. It was a carefully constructed argument delivered not in words but in actions, a comprehensive demonstration of why certain territories remained off-limits, not because they couldn't be taken through superior force, but because holding them would require investments of resources, attention, and blood that no rational organization would consider worthwhile. The brilliance of Bumpy's response lay not in its brutality, though brutality was certainly involved, but in its precision, its layers of meaning, and its ability to simultaneously punish an individual, recalibrate an organization's strategic thinking, and send messages to dozens of other crews watching from the sidelines to see how this confrontation would resolve. The details of what exactly Bumpy sent have been disputed, embellished, and mythologized over the decades, with different versions circulating through different communities, and each telling emphasizing different aspects of the response. Some accounts focus on what happened to Vinnie Teranova himself, describing consequences so severe they served as permanent reminders of the cost of disrespect. Other versions emphasize the economic dimensions, detailing how Bumpy systematically dismantled the Genovese family's nascent Harlem operations, with such efficiency that their 3 weeks of groundwork evaporated in 72 hours. Still other tellings highlight the political maneuvering, the conversations Bumpy had with other family bosses, the subtle ways he reminded the commission that their influence had limits, and that pushing too hard into territories where they lacked organic connections would create problems nobody wanted. What matters more than the specific tactics Bumpy employed was the comprehensive nature of his response and its strategic objectives. He understood that simply killing Vinnie Teranova, while satisfying on a visceral level, would be tactically insufficient and potentially counterproductive. A straightforward assassination might trigger the very cycle of retaliation he wanted to avoid, forcing the Genovese family to respond to protect their own reputation, escalating into a war that would damage both organizations and create opportunities for other predators to move into contested territory. Bumpy needed something more sophisticated, a response that punished the individual transgressor severely enough to satisfy honor and deter future violations, but that also provided the Genovese leadership with a face-saving pathway to retreat from their Harlem expansion without appearing weak to other organizations. The genius of Bumpy's approach was that it operated on multiple levels simultaneously, sending different messages to different audiences while maintaining internal consistency. To Vinnie Teranova, the message was personal and absolute. Your career is over, your protection is gone, and your future is measured in hours or days rather than years. To the Genovese family leadership, the message was professional and pragmatic. Continuing this expansion will cost you more than Harlem is worth, and I'm providing you with justification to retreat by making this about your soldiers' unauthorized action, rather than questioning your family's strength. To other organizations watching the situation unfold, the message was strategic and deterrent. Bumpy Johnson's boundaries are real. His capacity for response remains formidable, and testing him carries costs that vastly exceed any potential benefits. The Genovese family's retreat, when it came, reflected their leadership's sophisticated understanding of the calculation Bumpy had presented them. They weren't retreating because they feared Bumpy's violence. Every major organization dealt with violence as a routine aspect of business. They weren't retreating because they couldn't marshal superior forces. The Genovese family had access to more soldiers, more weapons, and more conventional power than Bumpy's operation. They were retreating because Bumpy had demonstrated that holding Harlem against sustained resistance would require dedicating resources that could be more profitably deployed elsewhere, would demand constant attention that would distract from other operations, and would potentially provoke alliances among other Harlem operators who preferred Bumpy's relatively stable rule to Genovese occupation. This kind of strategic calculation represented the highest form of criminal statecraft, where success was measured not by how many battles you won, but by how many battles you convinced your opponents weren't worth fighting. Bumpy understood something that many powerful organizations throughout history have failed to grasp. Territories aren't truly controlled through conquest but through legitimacy, and legitimacy couldn't be imported from downtown or imposed through superior force. The Genovese family could occupy Harlem the way an army occupies hostile territory, establishing checkpoints and enforcing compliance through intimidation. But occupation wasn't the same as control. Real control meant that local operators worked with you rather than against you, that residents provided information instead of protection to your enemies, that your operations ran smoothly because people accepted your authority rather than constantly probing for weaknesses. Bumpy's 17 years building relationships throughout Harlem, his integration into both the criminal underworld and the legitimate community, his reputation for a certain rough fairness in his dealings, and his demonstrated capacity to provide both protection and punishment had created a form of legitimacy that couldn't be replicated by outside organizations, no matter how powerful they were in other contexts. The Genovese family's attempt to bypass this legitimacy through intimidation had failed not because they lacked the capacity for intimidation, because intimidation alone was insufficient to transform occupation into genuine control. Bumpy's response to Vinnie's assault made this calculation explicit and undeniable. the retreat, when it happened, was managed carefully by both sides to preserve face and prevent the kind of humiliation that might require counter-response. The Genovese family didn't publicly announce they were abandoning Harlem operations. Instead, their soldiers simply stopped appearing, their protection rackets quietly wound down, and their leadership sent subtle signals through intermediary channels that they recognized Bumpy's position and wouldn't challenge it further. This mutual face-saving allowed both organizations to maintain their reputations with outside observers while acknowledging the reality of the situation to each other. The Genovese family could frame the retreat internally as a strategic decision to focus resources on more profitable territories, rather than an admission of defeat. Bumpy could claim victory without forcing them into a corner where pride required continued confrontation. The lasting impact of this confrontation extended far beyond the immediate resolution between Bumpy Johnson and the Genovese family. The story of what happened when Vinnie Teranova slapped Mayme Johnson became one of those cautionary tales that circulated through New York's criminal networks for decades. A teaching moment that reminded new generations of operators why certain boundaries existed and what happened when people forgot them. It demonstrated that true power wasn't about winning every confrontation through superior force, but about structuring situations so that rational opponents decided not to confront you in the first place.